Well, I was called to the White House to interview Bill Clinton. I spent several hours with him, just the two of us. Well, actually, there was another guy from Christianity Today as well. And we could ask him anything. And I learned early on that if you charge in there, Mr. Clinton, you realize how many people will oppose you because of you? Immediately, those walls go up. You'll never get anything interesting from him. You'll only get these kind of sound bites that he's said 1,000 times because there's no real authentic dialogue going on. And so it becomes a performance. And that's no fun at all. So my job as a journalist is to draw out of him something that will represent him authentically so that the readers can judge whether they agree or disagree, whether they like him or don't like him.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I hope this next episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you enjoy it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. That way you'll never miss a thing. Pastors, I know how hard it can be to keep your sermons feeling fresh and relevant, and especially you're preaching week after week. So maybe you hit a writer's block or it's Friday and you haven't really finished things up. I want to help. So I've got a 10-step preaching cheat sheet. After decades of preaching, I simplified the whole prep process into a series of steps and reminders that can help you ensure your sermons are engaging, relevant, and memorable. Super easy to use, 10 simple prompts with examples, and you can start using it as early as this Sunday. So visit preachingcheatsheet.com or click the link in the description and you'll get a copy sent to you for free today. This episode is also presented by 10 by 10. Did you know that approximately 1 million young people in America drift from their faith every year? And this means that by 2034, 10 million young people will walk away from their faith and miss out on experiencing the abundant life that Jesus promised. Well, imagine if we could do something to reverse this. That's why 10 by 10 was born, a national initiative created to help make faith matter more to 10 million young people over the next 10 years. Together, we can turn the tide of young people walking away from their faith. So the question is, will you answer the call to help 10 by 10 advocate for the faith of the next generation? You can go to 1010.org to learn more. That's 1010.org to learn more. And now to today's episode. Philip, welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I brought my special Commonwealth mug in honor of your Canadian brethren there.
There we go. Well, most of the audience is American, but for the Canadian and Commonwealth people listening, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, good to be with you today. Yeah, and I'm drinking tea in honor of that.
All right.
But you've got the cool mug. Philip.
All right.
So, it was interesting. You're re-releasing What's So Amazing About Grace 25 years later. Pivotal book in my ministry. I mean, I still remember the first time I read through it, and it was very powerful, moved me to tears, made me go, this is a God I want to follow. I'm signing up for this. But you wanted to call you had a subtitle for it when you were first ready to release it. I want to start there. What did you want to call the book?
Yes, when I turned it in, I said, here's the title. It's What's So Amazing About Grace, and Why Don't Christians Show More of It? And they said, well, I don't know. A lot of Christian books are given as gifts. And if somebody gave you a book with that title, you'd think, what's going on here? I said, well, yeah, but we need to say this. And they finally convinced me. The problem, Philip, is that many words don't fit on the spine of the book.
There's a good answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but then I went back. It was interesting to me going back and revising and updating, Carey, because 25 years ago, the hottest news was Bill Clinton and a White House intern. How much has changed in politics since the world was looking up. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Communism pretty well collapsed across Europe. Fukuyama wrote this book on the end of history, saying the entire world is moving toward liberal democracy. We're all together in this. And my goodness, here we are 25 years later. And it's like we've rolled the clock back. We're in a divided society again, a divided globe with a Cold War heating up, actually, with threats of nuclear weapons and all sorts of stuff that we thought were past history. So in just 25 years, that period where even then I thought we need some grace, it has been amplified and ramped up.
What did you see in the late 90s among Christians that made you want to use that subtitle? Because I would say, yeah, everybody today listening to this in 2023, 24, whenever you listen to it, is like, yeah, totally, Christians need more grace. But what was so evident to you back then that would have been an accurate subtitle for the book?
The interest in politics was just beginning, really. When I grew up in a very faith-saturated society in the South, where everybody went to church, and there was this kind of Christian veneer over society. And there were really good parts of that. People are polite, they're nice, they say ma'am and sir and please and thank you and all that. And they went to church. But we never talked about politics until John Kennedy ran for president. And then he was a Catholic, so we started hearing sermons about if America elects a Catholic president. But that wasn't why we were there. We were here to be different from the rest of the world. And in those days, it was mostly in a lifestyle way, things we didn't do. We didn't go to movies. We didn't drink wine. We didn't smoke, those kind of things. And some denominations took it much further. The one I was in was much more strict than that. And that's how we were identified, come out from among them and be separate, the Bible says. And that's how we showed that we were separate.
Right.
Well, then there was a move toward politics, and it started in that era. And as I look back on it and I talk to people involved, these things changed for the oddest reasons. There was a move led by Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop on the abortion issue and some of the end-of-life issues. And they went around and drummed up support, saying Christians should really be involved. And for the first time, evangelicals and Catholics kind of joined hands on some of those issues. But often, Carey, it's because of a little quirk. So, for example, in the early 90s, there was no Zoom like we're doing now. You couldn't just get anybody on TV. So when CNN and Fox Network or whoever wanted a quote from a Christian, they didn't go to Billy Graham. He was hard to get to. You'd have to go through all these layers of people and get permission. And he was very careful and very busy. But people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson had a satellite uplink in their office. All they had to do is push a button and they're live on CNN. And they were pretty entertaining, especially Jerry Falwell. He's a funny, charming guy. And they were both very political people. And so the broader culture started seeing American evangelicals primarily through the lens of politics. And that's almost exclusively how they see them now. You hear again and again what percentage of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, and that's how they view evangelicals. And I think it's historically we should have learned a lesson by now that when the church and state get in bed together, the state always wins. The church starts compromising because politics is an adversary sport. You try to kill your enemies, not love them. You try to win. And unfortunately, I think in recent years, we've only enhanced the divisions going on in my country. And I know it's not quite the same where you are, but there's some divisions even in Canada too, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's changing. It's definitely changing.
Yeah.
When you look back on that, because you were very much alive and writing, and a lot of our listeners wouldn't have a memory of the 90s other than, that was my kindergarten or whatever, right? But you and I remember the 90s. What was shifting? What was changing? Why do you think there was a satellite link in Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, but why the moral majority? Why this kind of lack of, because you even mentioned in the introduction to the new book, the death of, there was still large bipartisan support for legislative measures back in the 90s, and that's crumbled in the last 20 years. But why do you think Christians got super interested in politics and culture and started the culture wars?
Yeah, they would probably say we didn't start it. The culture changed, and they could make that case. If you go back to when I was in kindergarten myself, that would have been the Eisenhower era, and "In God We Trust" was put on our coins in the 50s, not back in the 17th, 18th century.
I only learned that recently, that
Yeah,
was like, that's
right.
like 80 years old. That's it. 70 years
Right.
old, whatever. Yeah.
And well, I'm not quite that old, but yeah.
No.
whatever.
My math's bad. It's not the 2030s, it's 2020s. But yeah,
Yes.
you're right.
Yeah. And then same thing with the Pledge of Allegiance. I went to one nation under God. That was added, that phrase there. So there was a move. Billy Graham was always won the most respected individual in the United States. He always won that contest, more than even presidents and people like that. And there was this Christian consensus. We had come out of World War II. We felt we were the righteous nation, leading the Allies against, and there is some truth to that for sure. But the culture gradually started changing. Of course, we went through the 1960s, which was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These are not things you hear about in church. And in a sense, the culture war started with that bump of a whole new demographic of young people who were determining the culture. So television started picking up on that, clothing styles, hairstyles, glasses, all of that was changing very dramatically in the 1960s. I know a lot of your readers and listeners don't have a memory of the 60s. They weren't around. And I tell them, whatever rumor you've heard about the 1960s, it's true. It was a wild and crazy time. And in my church, for example, we had burnings of Beatles albums and rock and roll, and the idea of rock music in church, which is pretty common these days, would have been unheard of back then. It was still the piano and organ and hymns. And so a lot changed there. And then, of course, it kept changing. So the LGBTQ issues started coming up, and then transgender issues after that. And the church really didn't know how to respond. And so when people came along with kind of a political agenda, let's get our nation back, they jumped on board because they were worried. They were concerned about trends in the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where does the meanness come from, in your estimate?
Where does the meanness come from? That puzzles me more than just about anything else, Carey, because every year around Lent period, I go back through that lovely passage in John 13-17, Jesus last night with his disciples, and he's 33 years old, and he's telling them, I'm going to leave. I've done my job. It's finished. I finished the work. So it's up to you. What do we learn? Well, he starts off by saying, you're here to serve, not to rule. And he washes their feet, go out and find people whose feet you can wash. And then he talks about unity, how important it is to have unity, the same unity he prays for in the church that he experiences in the Trinity. An amazing thought. And then he says, and people will know you're Christians by your love. They'll know that you're related to me. You're my followers by your love. That's the clue. It's so clear there. And yet, Christians are generally known by their fractiousness, by the 45,000 denominations in the world, by the fact that we can't agree on things. And we do certainly a better job with the service. There are so many great Christian works around the world, everywhere I go, where there have been missionaries. There are great works of reaching out to the needy. But we haven't done so well in the unity. And again, partly because of that whole politics thing, love and politics don't go together very easily. And when people are afraid, their first response is not love, usually. It's pull up the barriers and define ourselves against something. And I think that's the period we've been in the last couple decades.
We had such a great conversation last time you were on the podcast, and we talked about your autobiography of sorts. and the meanness of your Christian upbringing. When you look back on that, Philip, I mean, everybody thinks they're right? I think I'm right. You think you're right. We all think we're right. Most of us think we're somewhat justified for what we do. When you look back on that kind of harsh church culture and upbringing, that narrow, rigid, we're better than everybody else, use the stick, not the carrot kind of childhood, what do you think the internal justification among your family, the church you grew up in, was in their mind? Like if you don't want to create a straw man, but a steel person, steel man argument, what do you think they thought they were accomplishing?
Yeah, I think standing up for truth. I'll give them credit for that. They really believed. We heard sermons about hellfire just about every week, and it's the children of light against the children of darkness. They would take these phrases even from the Bible and kind of dig their feet in the sand based on those phrases. And I mentioned at one point in the memoir Where the Light Fell that I would go around at the church's behest with these gospel tracts and explain to people that they were going to hell, and they'd have these kind of cartoonish images of hell. And then I found that it's really hard to have a good relationship with a person when your main object is to tell them they're going to spend eternity in hell.
Yeah.
That's a tough way to start. And I go back and we didn't emphasize how can we be known by our love. Later, I found there are some churches who do that. I remember hearing from one in Canada that used to go around and put parking coins in meters that had run out, and then they would leave a little notice on the windshield, under the windshield wiper that said, "We just want to be your friends, and if you ever want to come to a church, you might want to try ours." That's a great approach, isn't it?
That is a great approach.
Yeah, but we didn't have that approach, and yeah, it was just a time.
And it was a time.
Yeah, and I've been to other countries where Christians are a strong or a small minority, actually. Well, like communist China. That's an amazing example because there had been 7,000 missionaries in communist China when the communists took over in 1950, and Chairman Mao kicked them all out. And I've interviewed some of them who went to places like the Philippines or Hong Kong or Singapore, and they said, "We believed we were called by God." And we looked back at China and we thought, how can the church even survive without us to run the hospitals and orphanages and seminaries and things that we had established there? And then it was closed for about 30 years. When they left, there were probably 2 million Christians in China. When they went back, to their amazement, they found about 50 million Christians in China. And the Chinese did it just by being like Jesus in the midst of a very hostile society. And getting to know some of the underground church particularly, and hearing them pray. I never heard them pray, "God, get rid of this godless government." They prayed, "God, help us to be witnesses in the midst of it." And the greatest revival in the history of the world took place. I was going to say before our eyes, but we didn't know what was going on until it was open and we could come in and see again. And now people say there are probably about 100 million Christians in China. And I just don't think that would happen if they had stood on their street corners and preached about hellfire and brimstone. I don't think that's the way to draw a contrast to the people around you. And in the South I grew up in, especially on racial issues, poverty issues, we were on the wrong side of most of them and just separated ourselves from, I think, what Jesus really wants us to be.
How do you define grace for someone who is unfamiliar with the concept?
I kind of avoid a textbook dictionary definition of grace. At one point I say, I say this. I say grace means that that there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. God is a God of love. God loves you utterly. God, the God of the universe, is capable of loving every single person on earth. And there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And I think that's where grace speaks to our society, because we're a competitive ranking society. We judge each other by our looks, by our salaries, by what schools we went to, by what kind of car we drive. It's that kind of ranking. And Christians, I think the great sin that Christians are subject to is the same sin of the Pharisees, of judging, oh, I'm more spiritual than those people over there. Mm-hmm. As the Pharisee said about the tax collector, I'm not like that guy over there. And the tax collector had no grounds for God's love. He just said, God, help me, I'm a sinner. And Jesus told that story to say, which one does God listen to? It's pretty clear what the answer is. So grace is an expression of who God is in expected and unexpected ways. The expected way is that God is a God of love, and love just emanates from God. And that was Jesus' message. The unexpected way is the people who receive that love. Henry Nouwen used to say that grace is a free gift. Can't do anything to earn it, deserve it. By definition, you can't. But to receive a gift, you have to have your hands open. And if you don't, like the Pharisees, close your hands in a tight fist. I'm okay. Grace falls to the ground unreceived. And that was the sad thing about the Pharisees. They got everything right, but the most important thing, they kept all the rules. That was good. You couldn't fault them on that. They tithed their kitchen spices, salt, 10% of my salt, 10% of my pepper. And Jesus said, but you missed the whole message. And we're always in danger of doing that, every era of the church I read about.
Yeah, I think so, particularly today. So I want to go back to the 90s when you released the first, until recently, only edition of What's So Amazing About Grace. You said you didn't think it would sell well at the time. That it's like, yeah, you poured a lot into it, but you didn't have high hopes for the book. It's 2 million copies and counting now. What made you think it wasn't going to particularly do well when you released it?
Well, I mentioned in the book that, in the preface that I wrote, that when I put it in an envelope, back in those days, we actually put book manuscripts in an envelope and mailed them to a publisher rather than hitting a button. And so I stuffed it in this envelope, had a cover letter, licked it, put tape over it. And I said to my wife, this may be the last book I write for the evangelical world, surely, and maybe the last book that I'll write for the Christian world, because it's got a whole chapter on Bill Clinton, who was the object of much vituperation from the Christian church in his days. And now we look back and say, it really wasn't as bad as some things that have happened since then. But at the time, he was a lightning rod. Mm-hmm. And I've never gotten such hate mail as when I did an article on Bill Clinton, an interview with him. Unbelievable. And I thought, my goodness, I wonder what the White House gets. Well, I had a pretty good idea of what the White House gets. And that's what they think Christians are. Because if they treat me like this as an editor at Christianity Today, how are they treating Bill Clinton? So I had this whole article about, a whole chapter about Bill Clinton and that experience. And then I had a whole chapter about my friend Mel White. And Mel was well known in the evangelical world. He taught at Fuller Seminary. He pastored a Covenant church. He worked as a ghostwriter for people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and Billy Graham. Wrote books for them, but he had a secret life. And there was this, I tell the story of how under stress one day, he just kind of broke down and told me that he had been living a double life, that he was actually a gay person. He had gone through every kind of aversion, shock therapy to change, and he didn't change. So he was about to declare himself as openly gay, and he knew what that would cost in terms of his career. And this was a whole new world to me. I not knowing that, I had told anti-gay jokes about, around Mel, and now I was ashamed of them. And I learned about grace. It's put to the test not when you're around somebody just like you, who thinks like you, votes like you, but it's put to the test when you're around somebody who is challenging to you, maybe social status, maybe race, or maybe difference in morality. And so that was a time when my own grace was put to the test, both of those actually. And I tried to be very honest and open about it. And I thought that would be the end of my career as a Christian
Christians
writer.
would basically cancel you before there was actually cancellation.
Right. And it didn't happen. As you say, it's my best-selling book that I've written. And I think, I grew up in a very fundamentalist, Bible-oriented culture, and I kind of learned where the landmines are. And I also learned when you approach a really tricky issue, stay very close to Jesus. So I tell Jesus stories over and over and retell them and put them in modern context and just keep going back to Jesus and saying, hey, I am not the radical. Jesus is the radical. If you have a complaint, go to him, And I think that's always a good rule, actually.
So you got a lot of static over the Christianity Today article, but what happened when you told those stories about Clinton and Mel White in What's So Amazing About Grace? Did your inbox fill up with hate email, or what was the reaction? Again, 2 million copies. I mean, a book
Right.
went viral.
Yeah, it was very different. And I think part of it was because I did enfold them in a book about grace. I mean, this is it's a serious title. Somebody
You had 70,000 words, not 2,000 words, right? To unfold them in a story.
And that's why I did very carefully connect them to Jesus' teaching. And I wasn't writing about what is the right or wrong of this issue. That wasn't my point. It's how do I treat somebody who has this issue, even if I find it morally reprehensible. That's what we haven't done very well. And Jesus did that so well. So many of his stories, the wrong person is the hero.
I know.
It's the good Samaritan, not the good rabbi. It's the, it's the prodigal son, not the obedient older brother. All the way through, he just hammers that point home. And grace is always surprising and unexpected, and always goes further than we can imagine or even that we're comfortable with. And, I guess I represent my own readers by hitting into that unexpected wall and trying to come to terms with it and just saying, I don't like it, but that's what Jesus commands us to do.
Yeah. What do you do when you get a critic who writes to you for a piece, or somebody who really doesn't like your stance on it? Well, you're not really taking a stand. Well, you are. I mean, you have a point of view about grace, right? You're making a story. You're underscoring who the heroes are and who they're not. You've been at this many, many decades now. And what I sense in you is an open heart, a humble spirit, someone who enjoys good conversation, not someone who's cynical, jaded, beat down, tired of it, doing interviews just because you got to do interviews for the book. You know how that, running the junket. Sure. I sense a curiosity, a wonder, and a beauty in your heart. That's the word that pops in, Philip. How have you not let it get to you? And then what do you do when you see that stuff?
I learned a lot of that style by being a journalist. So, for example, I was called to the White House to interview Bill Clinton. I spent several hours with him, just the two of us. Well, actually, there was another guy from Christianity Today as well. And we could ask him anything. And I learned early on that if you charge in there, Mr. Clinton, do you realize how many people will oppose you because of you? immediately those walls go up. You'll never get anything interesting from him. You'll only get these kind of sound bites that he's said 1,000 times because there's no real authentic dialogue going on. And so it becomes a performance. And that's no fun at all. So my job as a journalist is to draw out of him something that will represent him authentically so that the readers can judge whether they agree or disagree, whether they like him or don't like him. That's my job. And it's not to oppose him. Mm-hmm. It's to bring him out in a way that is authentic to who he is. And so when I'm talking to somebody and I have a basic disagreement, especially as a journalist, it's really not my job to say, you're wrong and here's why. That just won't happen. My job is to say, let me see if I understand your reasoning to come to that conclusion. And then as I do that, I may say, but other people would see that differently. Other people would say the opposite of what you just said. What do you say to them? And I'm always just trying to clarify who they are and bring them out. And people kind of like being paid attention to, That's what journalists do. There are some who make their living by being the contradicting everything you say, but I don't think you get the authentic person out. You just get the script that is repeated 100 times.
So is that does that approach inform how you handle your critics if you get that angry letter or email or text?
Yes, I try to find something that they say that I can affirm. So I say, we really see this immigration issue differently, but I appreciate the fact that you seem to really care about it, maybe depending on what side they are, care about the legal structure that we need to honor or care about people who are oppressed trying to get into a free nation. I try to find something that I can just, we're together on that. I agree with you that those are both important concerns. We may end up somewhere else on the issue, but I applaud that and thank you for pointing out how important that is.
How do you keep your heart open in light of where the culture has gone, all the critiques? I mean, I asked Kevin Kelly that recently, the writer and former editor of Wired magazine. He said, remain astonished. I thought that was a great answer. He says, he's over 70 now. He's like, I'm just astonished every day. There's so many miracles out there. But why? I just love your disposition. And I talk to a lot of leaders who at 30 are starting to get cynical. At 40, I was cynical, and it's been a clawback for me, Philip. Like, really, I'm trying to find hope every day. And I'm just curious. You seem to have navigated that so well. What are some keys?
Yeah. Well, go back to some of the letters that came in about what's amazing about grace. The most moving letters by far, and there are maybe hundreds of them, were from families who had a gay person in the family and had seen them through you are immoral. We're going to break off relations with you. I don't want you here on Thanksgiving. You'll pollute your nephews and nieces, that kind of thing. And then they realize I've cut off my son, my daughter. And surely that's wrong. What I did to them, we have nothing. I don't even have any contact with them. And as you know from reading the memoir, I lived in a family like that. I have only one brother, and he and my mother didn't speak for over 50 years, had no contact whatsoever until the very end of her life. So when you're around people like that and they tell you their heartfelt stories, I think that's what I learned from Jesus, that the person is so much more important than the principle. Really, God is the one who judges the principles, how you did in life. That's not my job. My job is to love. My job is to serve. And that Jesus is so clear about that, especially in the passage I mentioned, John 13 to 17. And frankly, when you do get to know these people in their pain, it's easy to care. It's easy to see their perspective. So the more I didn't cut off relations with Mel White, I'm still in touch with him. And we've had many close contacts over the years, and he's a great friend. And there are some things he's done that I wouldn't feel comfortable doing. He goes around protesting Christian colleges because of their attitude or their rules about gay people. And I'm not a protester, and it's a conflicted issue, but I do care about Mel, and I won't stop doing that. And I think everyone's going to not stop doing that.
I feel like there might be another question there, because I think we're such a factionalized culture, so tribal right now. And there's a lot of people who'll be, well, if you're going to go and protest Christian colleges, we can't be friends anymore. If you're going to vote X and I vote Y, we can't be friends anymore. What are some keys to loving Mel, who you've known for many, many years, when your paths diverge? And I'm sure you've got dozens of other people in your life like that too, Philip.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tell the story in the book very briefly about the original Jane Roe versus Wade. And this is a woman she had kind of an unsavory past, and she got caught up, got pregnant, wanted to have an abortion, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the pro-abortion lobby kind of got behind her and made her their poster child. And Operation Rescue, of course, is a Christian organization that strongly opposes abortion. And they would deliberately in fact, they rented an office in the very building where Planned Parenthood had their offices, and they would have these posters and sometimes march up and down the parking lot with these signs and appear, and they would call her a baby killer and all this. Well, then the president of Operation Rescue changed, and a new guy came along, and he noticed this woman. I think at first he wasn't even sure who she was, out in the parking lot on her own, smoking a cigarette because she couldn't smoke indoors. So he just sat down beside her and started talking, and turned out to be Jane Roe. It turned out to be, the center of the whole abortion controversy. And he just befriended her, and he would sit out there with her sometimes, and he wouldn't go and picket her and yell at her and hold up posters. And became her friend, and later she became a Christian, renounced her original stance, and it's a dramatic story. So there's your difference right there. He kept caring about the person, even though he didn't change anything about the issue, but it had a dramatic impact on that person.
So 25 years later, a revised and expanded version of What's So Amazing About Grace. What did you change about the book? How did you update it? How did you expand it? How does the voice? And let's start there. And then I have
sure.
Yeah.
Well, millennials particularly, or even generations after that, Gen X, Z. I guess we're out of letters now. I don't know what the next one's going to be.
I heard Alpha's coming down the pipe.
AA or something.
Yeah.
But millennials don't relate to a lot of the stories that I tell. For instance, we actually hired a millennial to go through and notice some things that she didn't relate to. And one was, what is Yugoslavia?
Oh, yeah.
That was a big deal back when I wrote that book. It was pretty, and here's this one nation that broke into 7 nations. Talk about an example of ungrace and not being able to get along. But she didn't even know what that word was. Well, unfortunately, it's relatively easy to substitute modern examples of ungrace. We're in the middle right now of a war between Russia and Ukraine, and it has global consequences. It's in the newspaper every day. So it was easy to go through and just change examples into more contemporary examples. And not just examples, but to show how the world has changed even in those 25 years, how it's become a world where ungrace is even more pronounced and in your face and unapologized. It used to be that I don't know what it's like in the Canadian Parliament, but in our Congress, people were respectful to each other. And we talk about my right honorable opponent, as they still do in London. Now, we had a presidential contest where the one candidate called her opponents a basket of deplorables, and the other opponent called his opponents deranged and human scum. Now that's how far it's gone from right honorable opponent, you know. So we're in a grace crisis, you know. We really are. People say the United States has never been more divided. Well, we had a civil war. I don't know if I go that far.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
That was
a bit
bad,
of American history.
Yeah. But definitely we're on the wrong trajectory in terms of grace versus ungrace.
Yeah. How did that make you feel when you revisited this and you I'm sure you kind of had thought about it in the 25 years, but looking back on it going, yeah, this is actually worse than when I wrote it.
Yes, I had some premonitions back in the earlier part of the century that the infatuation with politics was not going to end well for the church. And historically, it doesn't. I mean, it may for a while because you get your access to power and that feels good, and you can get certain laws passed that you think are important. But then you wake up one day and you realize I was used. That it's the politicians who run the world, not the church. And they're going to do what they want, and they'll use us and then just throw us away. And that happens historically again and again. And then what happens is you have to go around and explain to people, you know, the gospel is really not about what your position is on this issue or that issue. The gospel is about we can't make it on our own. We need a savior. We need somebody to fix us, you know, to change us, transform us. And that's not a political thing. That's a much more intimate, personal, religious thing.
You mentioned having millennials and Gen Z kind of pour over the material. What are you learning about these next generations and grace?
A lot of what I struggled with growing up doesn't exist anymore. In wide places. The legalism is not an issue. You know, fads that hit the broader culture, like tattoos, for example, or a funny hairstyle or whatever, those changed very quickly. They hit the church almost contemporaneously, you know, just right away. That was really different. We were trying to be different from surrounding culture when I grew up. And that was okay for people to make fun of us. You know, that's all right. That's a sign that we're serious about our faith. And now, I was in a mega church yesterday. We attended church that's very small, about 30 people generally, but I happened to be in another city and I went with friends to a mega church. And if you look around in terms of dress code, music style, you know, if you just walked in, you would have a hard time saying this is a church compared to this is a soccer match or something like that. And so that's different. And, you know, there's some dangers there, I suppose, but it's, we've gotten rid of the cage of legalism that upset a lot of people. Still, though, they see the church as a place where people go who think they have it together. Or some people say that people go to church have it together. Well, we know that's not true.
Right.
That's the image. So I opened the book with this story, same story that was there earlier in earlier editions, where this person is in deep trouble and somebody said, did you think about going to church? And just her explosive comment, church? Why would I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They would just make me feel worse. Mm-hmm. And that's what a lot of people think. And nobody thought that about Jesus. In fact, the worse you felt about yourself, the more attractive Jesus was. And so look at the people who followed him around. You know, they were the prostitutes and the tax collectors and those with leprosy and shameful diseases. And they went to Jesus because he would make them feel better. He would make them better. You know? And somehow we've that's one we need to keep working on. I think the current generations, millennials and Gen X and Gen Z, the only way you can get that one straight is just keep saturating yourself into who Jesus is and praying for what I call grace-healed eyes, the eyes to see people around us as Jesus saw them.
I'm going to give you a quote you wrote. Much of the world is living off the moral capital of Christian values, but it seems like the church has kind of forgotten the very values like grace that we're supposed to espouse. I'd love your thoughts, because this is a recurring theme over the last number of years on the cultural effects of Christian grace. As the church becomes perhaps a little less graceful, the culture is jumping on to Christian values, and the church is missing out on the very thing that is supposed to be ours. Do you want to comment on that? Because I think that's a very interesting observation.
Yes, and Europe is a great example.
Yeah.
Canada would be a little behind Europe, and then the U.S. would be a little behind Canada in terms of these issues. But I'll tell you a story. I went to Sweden one time, first time I'd been to Sweden. And I didn't know what to expect. And I had been to a lot of developing world countries where you have to watch out for pickpockets and dishonesty and stuff like that. And poverty was in your face everywhere. But in Sweden, I didn't see any poverty. The houses are nice. Even the housing projects are nicely kept. And if you paid too much, the shopkeeper would chase you down the street to give you change, And it was a place that cared about charity. It's on the top of the list on care for the environment and issues like that. And that's true of Scandinavia and a lot of Europe. These values that are Christian-like values, they're at the top. And I've studied the chart. So the most honest cultures, the most transparent cultures, those who believe in freedom of the press, they're all except one of the top 20 are usually Christian heritage countries. Now, in Sweden, not that many people go to church, very few, and actually a minority of people believe in God. So I'm thinking, okay, where do they get these values? I happened to be reading a book at the time on the history of Europe, and it made the little statement that for 250 years, most prayers in the continent ended with the line, "Lord, save us from the Vikings. Amen."
I did not know that till I read that.
Yeah. I thought, what happened to change Sweden from having this reputation of being this raping, pillaging, warring society into modern day Sweden, where they care about the environment and charity and all these issues that are important. And the gospel happened. And the gospel grows from the ground up, and it changed the culture from the ground up. But then what happens is, and this happened again and again in Europe, the religious powers start cooperating with the secular powers. You've got the Holy Roman Empire, you've got the state churches and all this. And then they start acting like the state. And if you go to Spain today and so many of those countries, Denmark, Czech, they have a Christian history, but you say, why aren't you Christian now? And they will tell you these stories, like in Spain, they'll tell you stories. Well, the church was allied with Francisco Franco, and he's oppressing his people. They were unjust. And he's right. So you've got generations who are looking back saying, the church is just like the government. You can't trust them. They're the enemy. And they've missed the whole message of why the church isn't the government. What we have to offer. What we have to offer is personal transformation that changes communities and then whole societies, as it did in Europe.
Do you think that's a danger for America today?
Yeah, I do, for sure. Absolutely. It's divided so that the chairman of the Democratic Party said we really have no room in our party for a pro-life person. And there are people who have values that are very much in concert with Democratic Party platforms, but say, there's no room for me because I feel like they're anti-God. A friend of mine started this organization called AND, saying, that's what the Democrats have left out. And where did this come from? Why do I care about the poor? Those issues. And there's some issues in which I'm more of a Democrat. There are some issues in which I'm more of a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as Martin Luther King said, we are the conscience of the state. You can't be the master of the state. You can't be the servant of the state. You got to stand outside of it so you can judge. I don't agree with this policy over here. I don't agree with this policy over here. Because as Jesus said, we're in the world, but not of the world. We can't live by those categories. We have our own categories.
If there's one message about grace that you wish church leaders would all hear, what is that message?
I wish that church leaders would find a way to communicate both the high ideals of the gospel and the safety net of grace. I look at the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus keeps pushing the barrier higher and higher. He said, hey, okay, you've never killed somebody. Have you ever been angry at your brother? Mm-hmm. Okay, you've never committed adultery. Have you ever lusted? And the people are sitting around saying, who can do that?
Yeah,
and
we're all
says,
doomed.
Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Give up. And then in that same sermon, he tells the story of grace that God loves no matter how far you've fallen. And that's the story of the Bible. I mean, look at the heroes. The heroes are Moses, who was a murderer and, had an anger problem. David, who was a murderer and adulterer. Peter, who denied Jesus, just like Judas did. The Apostle Paul, who made his living as a torturer of Christians. And these are the best of the lot. So that in Jesus' stories and in the stories in the Bible, nobody can say, yeah, but not me. I'm beyond the pale. God can't possibly love and use somebody like me. That is the message of grace. And that's a great message of hope that I wish every person who attends church would walk out feeling about themselves on Sunday morning or Friday night, whenever they meet. Just to realize that, that amazing, unstoppable love of God, irrational love of God. There's no other way to say it. Jesus told the stories. The guy who starts work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon gets the same pay as the guy who started at 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, that's not fair.
Nope.
And the moral of the story is, yeah, you're right. And if I can be generous to whoever I want to be generous, God says, don't try to box in my generosity. If somebody shows up at 5 o'clock and wants a job, I'll give them a job. That's God's love.
Yeah. Philip, I want to thank you for all of your work and for revising and updating what's so amazing about grace. I hope it's gotten into a lot of hands, but a whole new generation of readers discovers it. Books available everywhere you can get books. Where would you direct people online to find you these days? Where are you active?
I do have a website. It's called philipyancey.com. It's my name. And I'm an old guy, so I still use Facebook. I don't do all these, I don't have a TikTok. I don't have an Instagram, that kind of stuff.
But you are on Facebook.
I am on Facebook, and I do a monthly blog, not a daily or a weekly blog, but a monthly blog, and stay in touch with readers that way. It's a great way to communicate back and forth.
It's wonderful.
Some of my stuff is reprinted on some of these others like Instagram, but I don't personally spend much time there.
Beautiful. Well, Philip, thank you so much. I'm truly grateful for you.
Well, you're doing a wonderful work, Carey, and you're reaching the leaders. And I hope you can spread to them this message that they can spread to the people sitting in the pews.
I hope so too. You mentioned reading the Bible a lot, and the older I get, the more I think I'm the wrong person in the story, that I'm the Pharisee or the guy, the bystander, it's like it is an upside down gospel. And I'm seeing that more and more the older I get. And you are one of the voices.
And that's the danger. It is the danger, yeah. To get those grace-healed eyes and see ourselves, and the people around us as God sees us. That's like those prisms that turn your vision upside down, isn't it?
Well, keep writing, keep being a voice, keep being a force for good. Thank you, Philip.
Same with you, Carey. I appreciate it.